today we're going to be talking about engineering.
This is a challenge. This is hard. This is fun.
You started with Riot. How do you work in that environment?
We were taking a lot of the technology out of League of Legends to prepare for the other game with an architecture that would only run on PCs. One of the game teams was like, hey, we want to be on mobile too.
The more we're building the product, the more tech debt that is occurring.
I don't know if that's just the American in me and we all have some debt.
There's a lot of talk about AI. Do engineers have to fear for their future?
But I think their job is going to change.
Hi everyone, my name is Nanelle Anderson. I'm CEO of Devoted Studios and I'm your host at Devoted SpeakEasy. If you like what we do, please like, subscribe, share, or don't. We know you're watching. We have today an amazing guest, but the show today is going to be very, very different. As you guys know, we mostly focus on art direction, creative stuff, but today we're going to be talking about engineering. So bear with me, it's going to be different, but it's going to be wild. I have an amazing guest today with me, Serge Knystautas. Serge's original journey was in software. He brought an experience of building and running companies into video games and started with Riot, being their director of engineering and contributing to a ton of cool projects like Valorant, Legends of Runeterra, Wild Rift, and a bunch of other stuff. And last two projects he gave his love to was Palia. There's a very successful launch last year. It's a live operations game, and a brand new startup that was all over the news last year because they raised over $30 million as their round A, which in the latest climate has been a very challenging thing, Gardens. Hi, Serge.
It's good to be here. I really appreciate it.
Because I know a lot of your experience is with live operation games, and we're seeing, like, I don't know if you've seen the latest news from Warner Brothers, because they're feeling that the AAA games and box products are very hard to predict success of, so they're pivoting their strategy to live operation games, and like all the internet is all about that. And you have a tremendous amount of experience specifically around in building and supporting live ops games. So anything special you want to tell us about? Like, what is the role of technology and the engineering in live ops games? What people need to think about when embarking on that journey?
Well, thank you. It's been a wonderful journey. I really enjoyed having my first foray in live services games at Riot Games, which is really, I think, one of the preeminent companies that knows how to do it. They've had done League of Legends for 10 years when I got there and was still able to run a massively successful business off of a single game. So it is much more predictable than a box game where every year you don't know how it's going to hit. Is it going to land on time? And they just kept shipping more updates to League of Legends. And then we were able to launch a bunch of new games. My background before, I think most of my experience was in the digital sports marketing space, where you're creating all of the technology that surrounds publicizing college sports, basketball or football, or there's 40 sports actually in the NCAA that people participate in. And I always like to say that sports is an exciting industry because you can't change when the Super Bowl or when the Olympics or when the World Cup happens. You have to be ready at that time. And so learning how to develop software so that you can hit your time frame no matter what happens, that's really takes a lot of practice, and it's really different than both general tech, where you kind of ship a product and every time you deliver more value, everybody's happy, or games, where it is a momentary experience. And I think some people create this like really almost movie-like moment where everyone's really excited about that game, but then gradually tick off. And I love the idea of constantly delivering more features, delivering them on time. It's really hard. I made so many mistakes early on in the sports industry because you spend all year kind of planning for when the start of the college sports season starts, when college football kicks off, and it always seems to come up sooner than you expect, and you just have to learn how to plan and really get used to making updates. So much of what I think the technology really has to do is figure out what is hard and what do you want to do, but what do you actually have time to do, and make intelligent decisions about that and build a good foundation that you're then able to make a lot of updates, because the change is continual. Fans or customers, they always want new stuff. And so you got to be able to iterate and And that's, I think, what's really fun. It's like really finding that Zen balance of like, we got to make more change, we got to make more updates, and how do you get a team to do that effectively? It's a lot of exciting things. It can be really stressful at times, but one thing I found that's really different than the game industry is you're really incentivized from not crunching, because for a box game, the launch date is like the finish line, and for a live service game, the launch date is the start line. So everything you do, if you are exhausted by the time you get to the start of that marathon, that's going to be a very painful run.
What do you actually need to focus on? Anything that, while doing that, you're like, oh, I wish we thought about it when we were building it in the beginning?
There is release process is one that's really important. The second one I always then focus on is data telemetry. Like, I want to get as much visibility into what's going on as possible. That's the second area. There are test automation. I do find that testing is often very domain specific. So the way you test a payment processor is very different than you test the way an FPS works in game and some mechanics. And then organizationally, the incident command is the most important part of a live service to me, because stuff's going to go wrong, and it's very hard to deal with a bunch of stressed out people who are trying to fix things, and it's natural for everyone just to sort of start trying every single possible thing, and you really need to bring a structured way to have communication and reason about the challenges and make decisions to bring things back to working. Not necessarily to fix everything you spot at the time, but it's actually this weird state where you have to get everybody really calm and being specific about what you're changing, because what always happens if you don't do this is you have 4 people just start changing things because they see a problem there and then they see a problem there. But when you don't know what the actual root of the issue is, you no longer know when suddenly something changes, was it what you meant to change, or were there a bunch of other things that you just changed? So it's the incident command is like a very important process. And there's some tooling around that, like PagerDuty or Slack communication or different types of ways to really drive that conversation.
Can you elaborate for me on the release process? Like, if you would, in an absolutely beautiful world that we're never going to achieve, what would be the release process that you would build? What would be like the 5 key things that were like, everything else comes second, but if those 5 things are taken care of in the release process and then the way we build it, then we're going to be like 90% in?
Sure. So there's a couple things I think are really important. First off, every single change, and this is the ideal case, every single change has a description of how this affects the players. It may be very low level, it may be very simple, it may be meaningful, but I hate technical descriptions or describing the work that was done or saying it doesn't matter and nobody's going to notice. I want everyone explaining what their changes are. Then the second part during like a testing phase is when I really want to drive accountability. So we start to have things tested, and whoever made the change is responsible for fixing the change. So there really is this whole, if you make a change, you focused on what the impact is for players, and then there's this accountability. So we're not throwing it over the wall to an SRE team or the QA discipline. It's up to them to figure stuff out, or it kind of goes back into some bucket and whoever is on call is responsible for fixing it. I want that player-centric release notes, and then I want accountability to everybody who changed it. And then there needs to be some very clear decision maker. Typically you put as a release manager who's dedicated to that role. Sometimes it can rotate with an organization, but there needs to be no ambiguity about who's making the decision whether we go live or not.
If you have a smaller team, it doesn't feel like a release manager is like a full-time role. Who is like the best person to be a release manager?
At my sports company, I had the most success putting the customer support team as the release manager. So we would rotate it, and the customer support people were amazing because they were the most aware of what customers were doing and how they're going to use it. So they were able to evaluate the impact of changes way more than anybody else. Product managers want to ship new features. Designers want players trying their different game mechanics. Engineers want it perfect. But like the customer support group, they were my real heroes. I relied on them so much, and and was told I was wrong by them many times when like I'd have a team design some new feature and we all thought it was amazing, and the customer support team's like, no, it's not ready to go live. You got to pull that back out of the release.
So I have to fix it somehow.
Oh my god! At your sports project you were working on, when the customer support was release managers, what was the process? When did the build get to them? How did they evaluate?
We were doing weekly releases there. So what would happen every week, we would make the call to say, well, it was always on a Tuesday, we would cut a new version of the software. So we had the build system generate these reports and put things on a test server. And then it would be up to the release manager to look over, to decide what needed to get testing by what groups, and then track all the results of things. And then they would look to make calls as the results are coming in to say, good. Okay, that's not working. We got to remove that from this version of the software.
So they would see what QA tested and other stakeholders?
We didn't have anybody dedicated to QA. We had a lot of product owners and engineers and then customer support group. And so they would look at what was being built, and then depending on the stage of the feature, sometimes they would say the team that built it had to do the testing to see if it worked, but oftentimes they will pick a different product team. They would orchestrate basically that QA process. Ideally, it's in the release notes, like what is being changed. But in the case that there are major features or there are specific things, they would rely on those product teams to tell them what to test. So it was really dynamic. It really kind of depended on the stage of the product and which product was going out. But the nice thing about having the customer support team doing that a lot of cases was they were aware of what would impact players.
They want to do less.
Yes.
They want to be yelled less at. I love it.
Yeah.
I appreciate that.
And it works in both ways. They want to be yelled at less, but they also want to get all these accolades when it's like some new feature came out. They would get both the highs and the lows from however this went.
Engineers love everything structured and everything planned. How do you build that team culture of the engineering? What are the key things you feel allow to ship that successfully?
Well, so the first thing I always do is make sure I work with engineers to help them understand what they do is for the players, which certainly at some level people get, but people really have a tough time explaining something really low-level technical, why this is serving the players. And so some of that is like continually having conversations to say, this is about the players, this is about the players. And when you have those conversations, it then opens you up to figuring out maybe what can I do as shortcuts, or what do I have to do now and get it like really perfect versus like what can I do? Because when you make it about the players rather than the technical problems, that's like the first win to me. The second win I try to do is help engineers understand what decisions you can delay, because you will always know more in the future than you do now. And while it's important to build things so that they're really sustainable and build them well whenever possible. And the last thing, which I think is just something that I found I like to do and resonates with people, is this is a challenge. This is hard. This is fun. If this was like easy or we knew what to do, the work would be much boring. And I find that I'm quite able to motivate people to like, hey, we get to solve this. This is really cool.
Don't think of it as a problem. Think of it as an opportunity.
Could you give me like some examples of the decisions that in your previous career you guys delayed, and because of those delayed, like this is, what happened? Like what are the good examples?
Most games have a matchmaking service or some way to like route players. And it is so easy at the beginning of the project to think about, here are the 30 things we could use to calculate what matchmaking is. And if we can ship a version for matchmaker with the players for a play test that have like only 2 factors or 1 factor, so you have to build a matchmaking feature, but make it as simple as possible to achieve what we need. You're then going to learn through your series of play tests what is and isn't working in those play tests. So like you had that list of 30 factors that you would match people on, but now you're actually seeing the dynamics of how these matches are going. And you're like, oh, those 3 things that we had at the bottom of the list are actually the most important. So it's a question of like, you have to build a matchmaking service, and you have to realize that it's going to probably iterate and evolve over time. But if you can procrastinate on as many of the decisions as possible until you learn more, then it feels like you're doing it more expensively later, but the value of the decisions are so much higher because you don't implement a whole bunch of features that you then end up not using. So I think most people are incentivized to do it the most optimally and the most efficiently, but they give up the biggest impact and the value of that work. So I'll pay like a 20% surcharge on doing the work a little bit more efficiently when I know it's like 5 times more valuable than if I did what I picked earlier on.
How do you not create a culture of chaos?
I'm okay with a little bit of chaos. I'm okay with more energy and movement. I make sure that we have a purpose so we know where we're going. But I always tell my team, ask for forgiveness, don't wait for permission. Like, I want you going and making changes and doing things that are right. Yes, it is stressful for a lot of people. So what I do also is I spend a lot of time listening to people's anxiety, listening to them tell me all the ways that things have gone bad. I will share how things have gone bad with me. And we start to then make a list. We keep all of us sort of say like, hey, this is how we've all been burned by that project in the past. So maybe we will try to prioritize that, or we'll all acknowledge it. So I like to do a lot to keep safety, but I actually want a little bit of chaos. I want things moving without me having to track things. That gets me out of the way, and things just happen faster that way for me.
When you joined Palia, you grew the team from 25 to 70 people and also replaced most of the leads. Could you tell me more about the experience of building that culture, especially coming to maybe an existing team?
Yes. So that was a really difficult situation because I think that they were going through rapid expansion and the game had pivoted somewhat. I mean, not dramatically, but they had made some changes and engineering didn't feel heard. And so I went in and I sort of asked what was going on. And what had happened was there was a feeling that they didn't know how to make change. And so first off, I know how to drive a lot of change, so I could start to pick up that mantle. But then what I needed to do was find other people who could similarly drive change. So I was looking for other people I could step into leadership roles who would ask for forgiveness rather than wait for permission. So I had to start working through a bunch of different groups of people who would have that forward posture, people who would go and collaborate and go make decisions and get local wins. Nobody I replaced were bad. They're just like, I needed the style where I know what I was going to do and what I was going to drive, and I wanted to find people who would go along and be my allies in that effort. It was a wild ride, and it was like about 12 months of hiring a ton of people, and that's not always the strategy I'll take, but that was a very effective strategy in that situation to really get a team that would make a lot of change and really get us launched. I was very happy. Amazon just told us that Palia was the smoothest launch that they saw in 2023, and it was just really nice to see that like we had done a lot to really dig ourselves out of a lot of tech debt and a lot of challenges and really built the things that were the key pillars to the game.
What is that from that experience now that you're building a new team from scratch? What are the key things that you would install coming in at a new team?
It's a less difficult situation than what I had. I have much more of a blank slate. I have much more ability to collaborate with the other disciplines. It was really interesting during the interview process. A lot of the discipline leads, one specifically said, at the end of the day, this is a game studio shipping a software product, so you will be defining a lot of the way things work. And I took that as like a very serious responsibility. Like this really has to be something that we really are going to have to lead. And so I wanted to find people who had a good design sense, who like this genre and are able to really drive and solve some really hard engineering challenges. The cool thing that I have at Gardens is I have some co-founders who are very familiar with the indie space, and they're really used to that iterating process that just go at all costs, and philosophically they align with a lot of what I like to do in terms of just like iterate really quickly, make a lot of changes, throw stuff away, and it's a really good pairing. So I get to kind of build a culture and this super team that fits with what they're trying to do, and I think really achieve some really cool game mechanics. We'll see. We're still early on and trying to get to some good play tests, but we'll get there.
You have this strategy of collective performance and collective problem solving. What does that mean? If things don't work, you blame everyone. Is that it?
Yeah. I think you're guilty.
I don't like blame. Like, I just gave a talk to my engineering group on Monday where I basically leveled with them about what we're doing collectively. I want us to feel like we're a team. Some of this comes from a decade in sports where the team loses. Now, we're not going to point fingers to say that person could have done that better, but we need to acknowledge where we are. And I find one thing that's been so different about sports versus gaming, like in sports, at the end of every game, you know who won or lost. Okay, some sports you tie, but for the most part, there's like a very clear, painful win or loss. And in gaming, it's a much more subjective experience. And I think some of that is really played out culturally, where there's almost like a reluctance to acknowledge problems or challenges because it can be subjective, and there's acknowledgement that a lot of people have different opinions. And I kind of come in as like that captain is like, we're losing, we're down by 10 points, we got to do better. And I think that resonates. The honesty really is powerful, and it's genuine, and it's in a supportive, forward-looking way. So I do think we win or lose as a team. Ultimately, the players will tell us whether we win or lose, and I want to do great by them, but not in a blaming way. It's in a forward-looking, how do we do better way.
I should totally install into my collaboration with people, what do we do different? I feel like every question that starts with, why did you do this, never ends as a really good, why do we do this?
Yeah.
Never really ends up as a...
It's so tough because you have to be honest with like what the decisions were. But that's very hard to establish a lot of safety because people feel like they're getting picked on. So I always like to ask more, what can we do better? What do we do next?
What did we learn?
What did we learn? Have a growth mindset, but have collective ownership of the wins and losses.
You know, we're building a product. The more we're building the product, the more tech debt that is occurring, the more legacy bugs and all of that stuff. But then we have to do rapid iterating and prototyping and releasing. And especially like if we look at the cadence of releasing patches and updates in video games every 2 weeks, every 4 weeks, right? How do you release something that you need quick feedback that might be still buggy, that might probably create some sort of vulnerability in the game in general?
So I use several principles. Like, I usually tackle tech debt when you're changing a feature for players. So I don't like just investing in making things better that has no direct impact. If it ain't broke, don't fix it kind of thing. But if you want to make something better, that's when you go in and go through and really try to pay down the tech debt. I think I also don't aspire to ever have zero debt. Like, I don't know if that's just the American in me and we all have some debt, but I want to pay down the debt, but I know that this is a very effective tool to get there. So I look at like, what are we doing that's coming up in the future and what do we need to do repeatedly? I really want to invest in what we're going to have to do over and over again, and it's very clear that that's what we're going to have to do over and over again versus just like trying to make things better. I'm not a perfectionist. I'm much more of a pragmatist. So let's see what's changing. So for example, at Gardens, we're going to have some combat and we have some creatures and we're going to have different types of items in the game. And then when we realize we're going to transition to start doing it really, really well, that's when I really want to attack that tech debt and when we want to actually make a whole bunch of changes and pay that down. But there's like a time for experimentation and then there's a time to shift towards more reliability.
Well, Gardens is very early. Well, let's probably dive more in like the Palia example or the Riot Games examples, because like when you're alive, how do you work in that environment? Plus, on top of the tech debt and bugs and the future things that you want to do, you have this constant feedback that you also sort of need to adjust to make. And then you have analytics that also show where the people are dropping. So unless you're like doubling the operational team to like address all of that, which probably is not financially viable, like what is your priority list there? How do you attack it and how do you plan it in order to like move the project forward?
Sure. So one of my favorite examples of tech debt was at Riot Games, because it illustrates that tech debt is also a function of changes with the players or the business, not always a bad decision or a like short-sighted decision. So we were in the process of taking a lot of the technology out of League of Legends to prepare for the other games, and it was being done with an architecture that would only run on PCs. So then suddenly one of the game teams was like, hey, we want to be on mobile too. And with that, instantly we had all this tech debt because our architecture wasn't going to work for it. Now, we didn't clean that up for that first game because we know we didn't have the architecture we wanted, but we had to kind of learn how to get this all working on mobile. And then with the second game that went onto mobile, it was where we started to really make some small improvements to see where it was. And then with those two improvements in the book, we then went to the architectural review board and said, we need to rewrite this major chunk of the way that we connect to all of our backend services that we put on tens of millions of people's computer around the world. We need to rewrite that part because we now see how this is working and not working on mobile. So we delayed the decision until it wasn't just a theoretical, we went from one architecture that we knew we wouldn't have picked for mobile. We waited until we got more experience on mobile to understand what were the actual challenges. And then we launched the game. And the EP for the game's like, I don't care. Like, if that's happening, we have bigger issues than like, can it still connect to the friend service? So we went through and saw what players really were getting frustrated with, what scenarios. And that's then when we went through and said, okay, we now know, we knew our architecture wasn't good. We had a bunch of tech debt created because Riot realized we can go after different types of players by going to different platforms. Now we've learned some about how it worked. Now we're going to rewrite this major chunk of the SDK to all be in Rust and run super efficiently and fix all these issues that have been just piling up from 5 years of development at Riot. And it really was a beautiful story about how it got cleaned up. The cool thing, too, about it was through that process, I created such a attractive engineering challenge that I was able to have some of the most amazing engineers come join my project because they're like, wow, that is really hard, and it's going to impact every single player at Riot to do it.
The work that you were focusing on, right, especially at Riot, was around player ecosystem, like everything to support, not the gameplay side, but all the services. Let's imagine a world I'm building a live ops game. What are the key things that you would put the most attention on and you feel like, oh, in the beginning you didn't put as much attention and that kind of like bite you?
I did one thing good and one thing bad in that space. So the good thing, which I think was the right thing to focus on, was to really get the release management process down because, okay, we're updating this software. We have to know exactly how we're going to update this software to players, how to minimize risk, how to know what's happening. I put in place these metrics where I said, we're going to now track every single release. How many bugs did we have to fix during the testing phase? How many bugs did we have to fix after it went out to players? How many times did we have to delay a release? So I put some rather simple metrics. So that was something that I thought was really important to prioritize, and I did really successfully. The area that I didn't do as well is I didn't do a good enough job driving the alignments because I was really the center point for how changes would go out to every single game. I was controlling how software was going out to all the players' computers, which had to have a very structured, rigorous process. And it was kind of a bottleneck because it was really important to get that right and not break tens of millions of people's computers. People who work on platform or backend tech, they're used to making updates every hour, and they they're wondering why I'm so slow and why am I such a bottleneck, because for them they can just up things really quickly, and there's ways to have solved that, and I didn't engage with that problem until later in my time with Riot after we shipped a lot of the game. So that's something I would have changed a little bit more, driving better alignment with everybody across this. Riot's a big studio, it's very decentralized, and that's something I could have done more.
You know, when I think about the alignment, right, the building and alignment, how would you do that? Like now, what would you install? Like how would you approach it?
So I would have done probably a monthly status with all those teams to understand what they're looking at, what their roadmaps are, and doing some checks. It didn't need to match up perfectly, but if there needed to be awareness that there was some major work happening on this team that they were going to expect, and maybe they hadn't asked for it yet, or they had assumed it wasn't going to work. So I would have done more internal communication and more structured alignment in a way to like catch those kind of issues instead of just being almost too customer focused. I mean, I never want to say somebody is too customer focused, but I was focused on the external customers and not the internal customers. So not really looking at the whole picture and valuing the internal customers, you know, maybe not as much as the game teams, but more than I was. And there's a lot of different ways I could have done that.
You know, maybe, obviously, I would do it differently now.
In my recent chats with art directors in overall creative industries, there's a lot of talk about AI. So what I'm hearing and what I'm seeing is there are some tools that are coming up, but mostly for the web development so far. GitHub Copilot. Microsoft is doing a bunch of their stuff. There's a bunch of research. Have you seen anything that is coming for, you know, Unreal, for Unity, for any of the game development, maybe something on the back end? And do engineers have to fear for their future?
Well, I don't think they need to fear. And I think that engineers' challenges with AI is really different than some of the other disciplines, because I'm generally skeptical of what AI can do in the art space. And I think there's also huge copyright issues and challenges and worries that I think are very justified and haven't been worked out in court. Well, in the software space, there have been many billion-dollar lawsuits about who stole code or who reused code and all those types of things. So I don't think engineers have to worry about that. But I think their job is going to change. So there is a coding challenge that I do every December called Advent of Code, which is what I use to still remember how to program, since most of my job is working with people and leading. And I always use this as an opportunity to learn a new programming language or do something different and really kind of to stretch myself. It's a fun 25 days of Advent. You do get 2 programming challenges per day, and you really get to test yourself and try some new things. And this year I used ChatGPT and a couple different AI coding assist tools to see how things were different. And it was really amazing to me how much my productivity increased. And not just that, it was amazing how some of my behaviors changed. So we've been talking this whole time about prototyping and throwing away code, and I know what to say, and I try to do whatever possible, but I'm also human. And so as an engineer, if I spend like a day trying to get this program working, and then a week later, I realize that I don't need that program anymore, I'm emotionally connected to it and I don't want to throw away that code. And one of the really interesting things that happened with the code assisting tool is, well, half of it was coming from the code assist tool, and then the other half was me getting it working from what it had done. And I was fine throwing it away because I was not so personally connected to it. I don't think anybody's going to lose their job. I mean, I think if you make engineers more productive, we're going to need to hire more engineers, because it's more like, I don't think that there's like a ceiling to how much software and games are going to get developed. So I'm very bullish on it. I do think that it's going to take a big learning curve, and I think a lot of the products are very much in their V1 state where you don't see a lot. So at Gardens, we are starting to look at different products that have the ability to use AI to analyze different code bases so we can figure out, can this actually contribute to our development of Unreal? Definitely, as a game engineer, you end up working with like C++ and C# and Kotlin and Python and all these different languages. And right away, having a code assistant who can just tell you how to write a for loop in a matter of seconds, so you don't have to remember, this is my 4th language of the day, how do I write this, where do I put this semicolon and parentheses? That's really powerful. So I think that there's some very monotonous tasks that you end up doing as an engineer that will start to get automated. But I think it's just going to make engineers more valuable. It's just going to take a lot of learning curves, and the products will get better over time.
You mentioned that at Gardens right now, you're looking at some AI assisting tools. Can you tell me, like, what have you come across that you're liking?
Yes. So I think that the products that I like right now, well, we're using ChatGPT 4. I'm using it personally. I'm trying to get a couple engineers to also adopt it. Copilot is integrated into Visual Studio. It's really easy to use. And I've also tried SourceGraph, which is really impressive, and Codium. And these are two other products. The advantage of SourceGraph and Codium that I like as well is they give ability to analyze your private source code repositories. So it can start to understand how are we writing code, and so it makes it easier to follow consistent patterns. But then also, if I have a question about how my code works, it can look at how all the code that we've written works, and it makes it much easier.
So does it streamline code review?
We're getting there. I'm trying to figure out how to best do that. I have found less success at that right now, but all of those have features to say either explain this code, document this code, let me ask questions about it. I think it will get there, because I think that there's like a lot of simple mistakes that you can spot in a code review, but it hasn't paid off yet. So we're still experimenting.
Serge, thank you so much. I personally learned a lot. I'm probably going to be hitting you up on LinkedIn after that and be like, hey, you know what? Actually, a lot of more questions came up. But I really appreciate you coming to our show and sharing your wisdom. And for anyone who would want to learn more, we're going to have a second episode about how to get hired in the crazy new market starting in 2024, where AI is helping people to do tests and all of that stuff. And Serge is going to share all of his knowledge around that. Thank you, Serge, for coming.
Thank you so much. It's been my pleasure.